Ahoy there, mateys. I be the best darn game-pillaging pirate that ever did walk the electroplankton. Did you guys ever play that game? It was like a DS launch title, had a stage based off it in Smash Bros. It doesn't matter. Back to Weird Pirate Intro. You done clicked on this here video about me favorite handheld versions of console games. A topic that'd be pretty hard to explain, and even harder to do in a terrible pirate voice. So I'm gonna drop this act. You can thank me later. Yeah, I know, that was dumb. But I did it because, as a kid, I pirated pretty much every game I played. I was a poor kid with an obsession with video games drawn from a psychological desire to escape my own life. But it's fine. I'm fine. I make narcissistic videos for a community of strangers on the internet. I'd say I turned out fine. The truth is, I missed a lot of people's favorite games growing up because I either didn't have the consoles they were on, or just couldn't afford much outside of your traditional Mario, Zelda, and Metroid games, and even then a lot of that I only played at my aunt's house growing up because she owned them. But when my family got our first internet-connected computer, a whole new world opened up, even if it was mostly crappy games based on my favorite licensed properties at the time, because it was the only stuff I'd heard of. It's amazing the kind of garbage a kid will devote an hour to when the only cost is potential for viruses from shady ROM sites. Unfortunately, though, this didn't really allow me to keep up with new games. In an era of GameCube and PS2, I spent most of my time playing old SNES and Game Boy games. But eventually I discovered the new Game Boy Advance could be emulated, and later I got a flash cart for my DS where I could put basically any game I wanted on a micro SD card. Man, back in my day, pirating was the best. Anyway, this is all to say that while everyone else was playing the big console releases, I was finding the portable versions of these games. And you know what? A lot of them weren't that bad, and some of them were even really good. And since that's not something that companies really do anymore, it's mostly just, remastered ports of old games with little new content added, I thought it would be fun to highlight some of my favorite portable games that were custom-made versions of console games. This list really isn't in any specific order, just a catalog of memories mostly, but if you have any games to add to the list, feel free to put them in the comments below, because I know I didn't play everything and forgot much of what I did play, so feel free to remind me of any I missed. But without further ado, let's get on with my list.
Mega Man Extreme 2 on the Game Boy Color.
I'll admit, I love pretty much every portable Mega Man game. Any of them could have been on this list, really. But for the sake of condensing it so you don't have to hear me ramble for days about my childhood biases, I'm including the arguably best portable Mega Man experience. Mostly because it was one of the first times that I ever got to play a Zero. Because of course that's my reason. The original portable Mega Man games were essentially compilations of the console entries, with 4 Robot Masters at a time that have slightly different level designs than the NES counterparts. The Extreme games, comparatively, take a similar approach to the X games, combining various assets from the first 3 Mega Man X games, with again slightly modified level design. This was mostly due to the smaller screen real estate available, which still led to many moments of jumping into the unknown and hoping there was a platform out there. Again, this game isn't some amazing revelation, but it's a good version of this game to take on the road if you need more Mega Man in your life. And it really does play pretty well, though the terrible range of Zero's saber doesn't do this game any favors, and the abilities he receives are neat alternatives for bosses that have already been fought in traditional X games, but are still limited by range and spotty activation controls. And unfortunately it only gives you access to 4 of the 8 Robot Masters at a time, one of which is a terrible speeder bike level that I just couldn't be bothered to complete for the sake of this video. The reason I put it first is because unlike pretty much every other title on this list, this one did not come out when the game it mimics does. This game released in 2001, at the very end of the Game Boy Color's life, so it's really more of an honorable mention, but it feels so much like a toned-down take on the X series that it was still worth a mention, flaws and all.
Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance for the Game Boy Advance.
This game is surprisingly similar to its GameCube and PS2 big brother, despite being developed on much more limited hardware. Obviously, it's still lacking key features like voice acting and full 3D graphics, but the isometric, simulated 3D art style serves it well, and the already simple combat system lends itself well to the fewer buttons on this handheld system, though having to toggle between attacks is a little slow. The gameplay is essentially the same, as sort of a Diablo clone with direct control over the character, similar to the modern console version of Diablo 3, and the story is mostly intact too, though the areas are smaller and the environments less detailed. The heavy stat-based systems of classic Baldur's Gate games are still intact here too, and really the only thing I'd say brings it down is that it feels too much like a simple toned-down version. That means there isn't really much more to say about it. Regardless, this is a prime example of how to emulate a console experience on a handheld, which is why I put it so early, because I know the concept of this list might be a little bit confusing to grasp.
Tony Hawk American Skateland for the DS.
American Skateland was the DS version of American Wasteland on console, which was just okay in the oversaturated landscape of yearly Tony Hawk releases by the time it came out, but Skateland was notable for being the first Tony Hawk game on the new dual-screen system, and arguably a better game than its console counterpart. It also had a pretty sweet pun in the title. It introduced unique concepts such as creating your own graffiti, skateboard, and other customizations, and uploading them to others via the fledgling Nintendo Wi-Fi connection. And it was the first third-party game for the system that allowed online multiplayer. It also had a pretty fully featured level creator and surprisingly good controls for the first foray into a new handheld, as well as a handy map on the bottom screen, which made traversing this slightly open-world game a lot better. It also had a really slick presentation with a unique animation style to the cutscenes, and very nice cel-shaded graphics for a licensed game that came so early into the DS's lifecycle. I think the only one of all the Tony Hawk games I like more than this one is the original Tony Hawk Underground for consoles. And in a long line of genre-creating skating games, that's an impressive milestone for a handheld tie-in game.
James Bond Nightfire on the Game Boy Advance.
Okay, now hear me out. This game isn't amazing. I want to point that out from the start. But it's very impressive from a technical standpoint.
The other handheld James Bond game, Everything or Nothing, was a more generic top-down stealth action game with some cool moments, but nothing that stood out about the game aesthetically. Nightfire, however, tried to emulate the first-person look of its console big brother. And while it's definitely not the prettiest thing when you blow it up and compare it to modern games, it was pretty revolutionary when it released and set a graphical standard that not many other games could match at the time. The controls were a little clunky, nobody really begs to control a first-person shooter with a single directional pad, but it had some pretty loose aim assistance and a good variety of gadgets to play around with. And while the level design was pretty simple, it was essentially intact and presented the game in its entirety, though without the excellent multiplayer that I played the crap out of on GameCube. Seriously, everyone raves about GoldenEye, but man was Nightfire an amazing game. And it's refreshing that they could at least capture the essence of that amazing game in a bite-sized form that could be taken on a car ride. The ability to look around corners would have been nice though. Not very stealthy, Bond. Thought you were professional. Seriously, they're staring right at you.
Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance and Tournament Edition for the Game Boy Advance.
Following up a graphically impressive first-person shooter with a graphically impressive 3D fighting game. This entry is actually a double dose of portable versions, as the debatably good Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance for GameCube was actually split into two unique games on the Game Boy Advance, each with half the characters of the console version, though some were locked away in the crypt, as well as a few exclusives that add some additional flair to the handheld entries. Deadly Alliance was mostly a watered-down tie-in, with half the roster and a slightly more simplified combat system, only 2 fighting styles to swap between, and 1 fatality per character, with the weapons just included as special moves and not their own style, as well as a much smaller crypt system and a mostly single-player only experience. The sequel, Tournament Edition, brought in the other half of the characters, which is admittedly a lot of the lesser-known characters, but also included Serena, who had previously never been playable in any game. It also has a few more game modes and a bit more graphical fidelity than the previous GBA entry. These games are impressive because they bring the actual 3D combat of the console versions to an essentially 2D game, and they do it pretty successfully. I would never choose this version over the console version, unlike some games on this list, but functionally it works as a portable companion to an already great game. and is a testament to the ability of one of the best gaming platforms ever made.
Kung Lao wins. Fatality.
The Sims, busting out on the Game Boy Advance.
The Sims had a surprising amount of games on console and handheld back in the day, and pretty much all of them have you focusing more on controlling one character and completing objectives, while still watching your humanly needs. Bustin' Out was more of a spin-off though, rather than based on any PC version, with the ability to explore around a city meeting the eccentric citizens, and either being nice to them, or, my favorite, being the biggest dick you can be. Some of the prompts you can choose are just the worst, but also the best. Anyway, that dangerous look into my mind aside, this game is just a lot of fun. There's a decent character creation element, and it has a lot of the house customization aspects of The Sims intact, without the actual building mechanics, I'll admit, as well as a bunch of money-earning mini-games around your uncle's farm and in town that allow you to buy new items. This really feels like a more personal Sims game, and despite just being a watered-down version of what went to GameCube and PS2, it fits in the handheld landscape better than it does on console in my opinion. And there's just nothing better than freeloading on your stereotypical uncle's farm, while also hurting his feelings over and over again.
I know, I'm horrible. Let's move on.
Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers on the Game Boy Advance.
Okay, so I can understand if some of you tuned out even at the mention of a portable version of a movie tie-in game, because that should be a recipe for failure, and as far as I can remember, every other Lord of the Rings tie-in game in handhelds was terrible. But this one is a weird example of not being a ROM, but a game I randomly picked up as a birthday present from my dad, because he gave me a price limit, and I was a kid who was easy to trick with his favorite properties. But
this game was such a pleasant surprise, I actually ended up playing through the whole thing multiple times despite other games I could have been playing. This is another example of a Diablo-like game, complete with a small skill tree and regular loot pickups. Basically, you go through various levels of the movie, some ripped directly and others made up to pad the game length, which is still admittedly short, and kill a slew of enemy fodder while picking up gems, health, and stuff. Pretty simple. It plays well though, and has a decent level of challenge to it due to limited health and good enemy AI. It also has slightly different playstyles depending on which character you choose, similar to different classes in Diablo, which encourages replayability, as well as unique opening scenes for each character that sets their tone from the movie. This certainly isn't the best example of excellent handheld experiences, but it is a surprisingly good portable movie tie-in that's arguably more fun than the console version, which plays essentially like a generic Dynasty Warriors style hack and slash. It also has an impressively compressed montage of movie scenes introducing each playable character, including Eowyn. Nice to see the female representation.
SpiderManShattered Dimensions on the DS.
About 2 years ago, I put this choice on a list of my favorite Spider-Man games, and oh boy did it make people have opinions. But 2 years later, I stand by it.
The console version of this game is entirely different, and I love them both for different reasons, but I think this one is cool because it doesn't try to be a watered-down console version. It makes its own identity that plays to the strengths of the system, by being more of an exploratory Metroidvania-style game, with a map on the bottom screen, and the whole dimension-shifting gameplay mechanic is used like different worlds to explore to get the power-ups to open up new areas. For example, Noir Spider-Man starts without the ability to wall crawl, and Spider-Man 2099 originally just has a glide instead of web swinging. But as you go, the various Spider-Men not only learn new attacks, but also gain each other's special powers to use in their respective worlds. There are also health and attack upgrades, among others, just like in your favorite Metroidvania game. And there's some pretty solid boss battles when they don't just boil down to one-note gimmicks. The combat can be spotty, and the environments are pretty muddy, making it sometimes hard to see where to go next, but it gets points for originality as a handheld game that shares a name and concept with the console version, but not much else. This is one example where it's worth playing both, rather than this version just being an acceptable replacement. And I might have given the battle system some crap, but it does have its moments of brilliance.
Asterix and Obelix XXL on the Game Boy Advance.
This is one of those I randomly found online and thought, wow, this game looks amazing. And little kid me wasn't wrong. Back then, I didn't even know it was a handheld version of a console game, but this game was also released on PS2 and PC. It's probably the most graphically and functionally impressive GBA game produced, aside from maybe the Golden Sun games. It's essentially a fully 3D platforming adventure game, and while it obviously hasn't aged well, it does play well. It's a pretty simple game, just roaming each level, grabbing collectibles, and beating up a seemingly endless slew of the same enemy in order to activate mechanisms that get you more collectibles. The characters are fairly similar, but Asterix has the ability to double jump, and Obelix can push or pull heavy objects, and these abilities allow them to mix up the platforming a bit more than just being an explorative 3D beat-em-up. And there's even camera controls mapped to the L and R triggers, making this game feel like a full 3D game, despite the graphical tricks the game uses to simulate depth of field. This is another game that's mostly just on the list for technical reasons, but it is a fun and unique entry in the large Game Boy Advance library, and worth checking out if you've never heard of it.
Donkey Kong Land on the original Game Boy.
This was literally the second game I ever played on the original Game Boy. I remember as a kid, my brother and I came out for Christmas one year to find no presents under the tree, and our parents just pleased us punch when we reached into our stockings to find coal. We were on the verge of tears, but they laughed and opened the closet where they'd hidden all our presents, including some original colored Game Boys. Like Game Boys that were red, not a Game Boy Color. Mine came with Kirby's Dream Land, and my brother's came with Donkey Kong Land.
Which means after I beat Kirby in like 20 minutes, we were constantly fighting over his Donkey Kong game. And that's because it was absolutely incredible for some kids with their first portable gaming systems. This was a series, and the sequels were arguably better, but my best memories are of the first one, so it made the list. This first one was sort of a port of the first Donkey Kong Country game, but with different level designs and a few different worlds. In fact, the actual story, according to the manual, is that Cranky makes fun of the Kongs for their success in Donkey Kong Country being solely due to its amazing graphical power, and to prove him wrong, the Kongs accept the challenge to take on a new adventure in an 8-bit world. And that's just a fantastically meta backstory for a downgraded version of a game. The sheer amount of detail packed into these games on small screens with just a gradient of black and white was mind-blowing back then, and looking back is still very impressive when compared to the full-colored SNES version that was already pretty revolutionary for using actual 3D models rendered into sprite animations. This is one of the prime examples of how great handheld versions of console games can be if the developers put the effort in, as it literally uses the same assets from the SNES counterpart, but converted for use on the limited color palette and weaker power. This game is also cool because it actually performs graphically better on the Super Game Boy, and even better than that on the Game Boy Color. This wasn't entirely unusual for games, but I'd argue that the Donkey Kong Land games are some of the most drastically better examples when compared to the regular Game Boy graphics.
Ducktales on the original Game Boy.
DuckTales, woo! Sorry, I had to. You did it too, don't lie to me. I have a confession to make. I had no idea this game existed on any platform other than the Game Boy until everyone started talking about the modern remaster, which was not based on the Game Boy version, and I was like, wait, that's all I played. I know. I'm sorry. I told you, I was a poor child that missed out on a lot. Give me a break. And I still think, mostly out of principle, I've still only played the Game Boy version. Bite me, scrubs.
But, in a lot of ways, I think that's a major testament to the importance of this handheld version, as I'd argue this one doesn't sacrifice much in the translation to the green and black screen, but allowed me to still experience this fantastic game during my apparently sheltered childhood. Because I haven't played the console version, I can't really discuss how it differs, but to me this is the definitive version of the game anyway, not some watered down port. So I don't really care about any way that it's different in the first place. I loved this game growing up. Oh, and I never watched the show it was based on either. I was a Darkwing Duck kid. Yeah, now you see why I put it last. Wanted to make sure the angry mob didn't click out early during this controversial opinion. Suckers. I'm totally gonna watch the rebooted version of the show though. That cast looks incredible.
So, there you have it. A very strange list of games that had a major impact on me as a kid when I was too poor to actually buy console games and had to emulate mostly budget versions on GBA and DS. As well as a few hidden gems from the first generation handheld too, just to mix things up. Like I said, if you have any favorite handheld versions of games like these, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to try out some more, and maybe I'll even do a follow-up video of user-suggested games to let you know how I think they stack up to the big dogs. Ugh. I don't think I've ever said the phrase big dogs before. I don't like it. I don't want to be a big dogs type of guy. Anyway, that's all for now. So, until next time, have fun.